Hello and welcome to another episode of the Modern Maker Workroom. I'm Mathew Gnagy, and today I'm going to be talking about this particular style of collar that I'm wearing. The underpropper, the supportas, which you can see right here in black taffeta, that is called the Golilla, and it is from that garment that the collar style takes its name. Now, the top collar has a different name. It's called the Valona, and it originated as a Dutch fashion, but in the 17th century, when the figure of eight style ruff was banned in Spain, this style of collar became popularized, mostly popularized by Philip IV, and then the fashion took over and it became a staple of Spanish wear. In contemporary accounts, they are listed as not particularly comfortable. People did not care for the comfort very much, but they really liked to have their throat covered. One of the reasons why it came about is that there was a bit of an outcry when the figure of eight ruff was banned because men did not feel comfortable having their Adam's apple exposed. So this style of collar took over, and it's a really interesting construction, and I can't wait to show you about it. Come with me on this journey. Grab your cardboard, your taffeta, your wool, your thread, your needles, whatever, or pull up a seat, grab a cup of tea, and just watch for the next 20 minutes while I show you how this whole thing came together. Thanks so much. Now let's get stitching. The whole process is begun by taking several layers of cardstock and putting them together around the edges. Now, in history, they would have been glued together, usually made with several layers of pieces of paper, and then pasted together and cut to shape. A nice piece of wool is pressed. This is a bit of a coarse wool that I'm using to create the padding layers around the cardstock. I take my pattern and I trace around it with a piece of wax. I will leave some relatively large seam allowances just to give myself room to really work and to pull snug as I wrap the padding around the foundation. What I don't want is to have hard edges of cardboard sticking out against the outer layers of fabric. So you can see the seam allowances I'm using are 1.25 inches or so, and it is important for me to have these wide seam allowances so that I can work efficiently. Once it's cut out, then I'm going to clear my workspace and I'll begin clipping the inner edge of the neck. This just makes the curve work very well as I stretch and pull it around the foundation. I'm clipping all the way to the wax chalk mark and through it because I don't want to have any tension whatsoever as I'm trying to pull this around. I don't want it to try to pull inward at the neck. So I make sure to put those clips nice and deep so that they fold back nicely over the cardboard. Now here I'm using a glue stick. They probably would have used some kind of hide-based glue, I suspect, to glue things onto the foundation. I'm treating this partially like a millinery project and partially like a tailored collar project. Now that the interior is done, I'm going around the outside with the glue stick and very, generously pasting glue in place. And then once that's done, then I will fold the edge back onto the card foundation, and I'm pulling this quite snug as I do so. And one of the things that should be understood is that the tension with which you pull the wool around the foundation also helps give some support to the cards itself. With the tension of the fabric coupled with the stiffness of the board, together you end up with something that is supporting itself and synergizing between the layers, keeping a nice structure. It is similar in effect to pad stitching layers together, and cumulatively they support each other. So I have one side complete. You notice that I mitered the corner and then cut the end off, and here I'm doing the same thing. I'm just cleaning it up. This will all be covered, so I don't really care about finishing it so much. Now I need another layer, so I'm going to take the second piece of the two layers that I cut earlier, and I'm going to chalk on the shape, just as you see right here. I'll chalk it in place, and then I'll cut it out flush with the lines this time, so removing all of the seam allowances that I made before, and this will allow me to cover the raw edges on the underside of the collar as I have it now. So here's the piece, and I'm going to put some glue on. Now I started doing this in the wool section and it's just kind of terrible, so I tried letting the glue stick adhere to the wool, and it just doesn't want to. I had to like tap little globules on. So eventually I just went with putting it onto the cardboard and hoping for the best. Everything just needs to be held temporarily anyway, because at some point all of it is going to get sewn together. So all of these glues and pastings and everything are just taking the place of pins, which are kind of hard to put through the cardboard. But eventually it'll all be sewn. In fact, that'll be the very next step. I'm just using a couple of pins to secure the ends at the center front of this collar to keep them in place so that it'll be easy to stitch them when I get around to it. With everything glued and in position, I'm just going to squish it a little bit with the iron to give it some flatness and some structure. And I have a nice heavy silk thread. This is just what happened to be nearby. And I'm using a catch stitch so that I catch the trimmed layer and the folded layer very easily. And this will help keep it in place so that nothing moves. When I reach the corner, I just simply turn and continue to stitch. And once I reach the end, I'll simply move my way around the end and close it carefully. I tried to start with catch stitches, but the angles were just so bad from the interior of the collar that it made more sense to use a whip stitch to go around the edge, which ended up being quite fast and very secure, and I kind of liked the clean and tidy appearance that it left when I was done. It's really easy to get the stitches done regularly. You exit the needle right at the fold of the underlayer as it wraps around, and this just pulls everything nice and snug, and I just really was happy that it came out so well. Again, pressing up another chunk of wool. Now, typically I will cut all of this stuff out at the same time, but since I've never made one of these before, I'm doing it in small steps as I determine bit by bit what this garment actually needs. Now, I don't fully know the precise construction of the original, but I am building this with an eye toward similar types of structures and how they're constructed. So this next layer that I'm cutting out is actually 2 layers of the wool that's going to just be used as a padding. But in order to keep everything in from the edge, I'm removing about 1/4 of an inch of material from the line. So you can see that I'm trimming inside the line quite a bit. And you know, it's just 1/4 of an inch, maybe 6 millimeters or so. And it helps to keep this further away from the edge. With that cut out, I'm now going to put it in place. And again, I tried doing this with diagonal baste. I tried a couple of different stitches at the beginning and it just didn't work. So what I ended up doing was this sort of wide catch stitch that I'm putting just on the face of the material. This also will help give a little bit of girding structure to the layers themselves. These long strands of silk will act a little bit like guy wires, holding it in place and preventing it from deforming over time. Now, of course, I don't know if this is the actual construction because I can't see the inside of the original, but it works really well for this process that I'm using here. So once that's in place, then I'm going to give it a press and we're going to move on to working on the neckband itself. So this is just the top. There's actually a neckband that is underneath. I'll be honest, it is very much a job of stamina. Your hands will wear out pretty quickly when you're doing these stitches because you're pushing through so much fabric. Once all of the pad stitching is done, then I take another strip of material and I wrap it around the collar stand, keeping it tight and in place so that I can have it very firmly wrapped. Just once the silk starts to go on top, I don't want any of the bulk of the wool causing trouble with how the silk is going to lie on the outside. So here you see me using a similar technique to what I did on the interior edge of the neckline of the foundation itself. I'm using a whip stitch to secure the interior edge. It's really fast, it's very simple, and again, it doesn't have to be particularly neat because all of this will be covered by a nice sheet of black taffeta when this is done. Once the neckband is complete, I'm going to place the collar on top just to have a look and make sure that everything is lining up properly, and it sure looks like it is. Now it's time to move on to the coverings. I'll start by giving my taffeta a nice, firm, very damp press. I want to get all the wrinkles out. I want it to be nice and crisp. And just as before, I place the pattern onto the taffeta and then cut it out with some nice generous seam allowances. Now the seam allowances that I'll use here are just as wide as they were before. I need to know that I have enough fabric to go around the padded foundation shape. This pattern piece that I'm working with doesn't have any padding on it, and so I could very easily cut too small a seam allowance and then not have enough to wrap firmly around the padded foundation. I will also make some nice substantial clips in the interior curve of this neckline to allow me to pull those tabs back and wrap the silk tightly around the foundation. To begin, I will find the center and I will just pin my pieces of fabric up just a little bit so that I can start the wrap around the foundation. And then I will use long strands of thread to catch the tabs and then catch the fabric at the top as it wraps around. When I reach closer to the corner, I switch to just basting the silk onto the wool. Too much tension means the corners might curl down instead of up when they're worn. Once I reach the center front of the collar, as I'm basting along here, I'll turn the edges in, secure them in place, and then work my way around the interior of the neckline until I have met up with the tabs that are already secured. Once that's done, I will turn my attention to the second half of the collar and work my way around in a similar manner on the opposite side. When that's complete, I will grab my iron and give the whole thing a little press on both sides to make sure that it's nice and tidy. Next, I'll grab my second layer of silk taffeta that I cut out, and I will fold it under and back and pin it in place so that I can begin hemming around the edges and completing the shape. Once all of the pinning is done, then I'll hem the lining in place. Again, I'm using my heavy black silk thread and I am felling around the outside edge. Now this does take a little bit of strength and maneuvering because the cardboard is quite stiff. With the collar complete, it's now time for me to cover the neckband with the silk as well. Now this is just a wide piece of silk that I have basted along the top and then wrapped around, and I'm hemming it in place. With the length of the collar band covered, next I will just turn the ends of the silk in very carefully at the end of the bands and stitch it firmly in place. With that complete, then I can move on to attaching the band to the collar foundation itself. Now, this is done in a very crude way with this particular piece because I am in a hurry to test the mechanics of it to make sure that it all works correctly, so I just use a whip stitch to put everything together. I'm going to go ahead and finish this up. I'm going to move on to making the collar that goes on top of this, and then I will test the whole thing and see how it works. Then I will do a little bit more research and make new choices and make a second one. Something that I learned from a friend who specializes in ruffs. If anyone doesn't know who Noel Gilliam is, he is a brilliant ruff maker and has done so much research into the world of starches and how to use them. But one of his recommendations was to starch the linen before I make the collar to make the construction actually easier. Linen can be a very shifty fabric, it can fray a lot, and so in order to seal the edges and make this very effortless to work, I went ahead and starched the linen before I even started doing the pleats and the collar, and it just made the whole process so much easier. Now, my initial thought had been to do the tucks the way that I'm doing in this particular segment of video, where I'm treating them like small little pleats. So I'm folding the fabric and then I'm stitching with backstitch and then I'm pressing it out. And that's just because I didn't have a good enough look at the actual extant garment. Well, I had done about, I guess 5 or 6 of these little tucks before someone sent me an article that was written in 1969 by someone who had actually analyzed the garment. And the way they've described the tucks is that they're not really tucks at all. They're sort of like little rib wales that are pulled up into the fabric by folding it and using a whip stitch around the folded edge. Now when I tried that, it didn't come out nearly as crisp and accurate enough. So what I ended up doing was I changed to using a running stitch, very carefully threaded through the grain of the fabric so that I was perfectly on grain, and then I would fold the fabric on that running stitch and whip stitch it with the needle and thread very, very tightly. So almost a combination of couching and whip stitching tuck. Once you've done all of that together, it's very easy to handle in the hands. It's very convenient, but it creates a much stiffer tuck in the fabric that acts almost like a teeny tiny little wire-like bone, and that completely changes the way the collar works. It also makes it much easier to shape the back of the collar when all of the pleats are done, because the foundation itself is quite curved, and without all of these tucks, without the shaping, you can't make it come to the right shape. This is cut on very straight grains, this Valona collar, and it needs to go onto the relatively curved and rounded shape of the Golilla. So together, the synergy of these little tucks, and then what we'll see later is this brilliant use of bias manipulation and the tucks to create something that is curved and shaped out of a piece of fabric that is cut on the straight grain. To finish the outer edge of the Valona collar, I used an interpretation of what I had read in the article from the 60s, and it spoke of a rougher, stiffer fabric being used at the outer edge. Now, I interpreted that as a binding until later rereading it, and I believe the wording that she's using in this article indicates that it is a very heavy, stiff piece of fabric that is rolled up into the hem as it's stitched. So that's very complicated, and I'll be doing that on the next iteration of this collar. But for this one, I just went ahead and was using a binding, and as I'm finishing the binding, I'm also working the hem stitching around the edge. And for those of you that don't know, hem stitching is a technique where you use thread to sort of pull open holes in the material in a very predetermined sort of way, and it's frequently seen along the edges of collars like this. We're about to sew the neckband on, and I will tell you, this is where all of what I think of as the real magic happens. And the reason for that has everything to do with that manipulation of the bias that I mentioned earlier. So I'll start by matching up center back and pinning evenly across my tucks, maybe cinching them in a little bit to enable more curvature to come into the back of the collar. But wait till you see what happens when I get around here to the bias edge. You will see me start very carefully pulling up fullness, almost like I'm adding ease into the pinning. So there's these little bubbles that will happen between my pins. But then as I'm back stitching, you'll see me pin down the corner that is directly 45-degree angle to where I'm stitching, and I will pull tension on that corner, and what that does is it forces the threads to contract. So I'm using that tension and that pressure to cinch these things in very smoothly so that there are no obvious tucks, but it's clearly shrunken down in the bias area of the neckline. And what this does is it pulls the fronts around so that they sit much closer together, and you can then see this curved shaped collar with all edges on the straight grain. It is a genius move by these historical tailors to use the bias in this manner. It just blew my mind when I noticed it in the extant piece. And I can say in retrospect, after having made this first sample, that I actually had too much fabric being pulled into that area. My collar ended up being a little bit oversized and a little bit too out of proportion to the original type of scale that was required for this sort of garment. It's a little bit too overstated, I think. And because of that, I ended up having to cinch in just a little bit too much fabric, and I don't think it steamed down as well as it would if I had just a tiny bit less. So in the finished garment, when you're looking at it from the top down, especially when you compare to the extant original, you'll see that I have a little bit more rippling because of the drawing in of the bias area. Once the neckband has been sewn on, and before I close the neckband in place, I'm going to give this a really good steam because I want to, as quickly as possible, try to steam out the fullness that I just eased in the bias area. I really want to see how flat I can get it, and if I can't get it as flat as I want, I need to be able to pull the stitches out and make corrections. So I want to do this step before I close the neckband, because afterwards then it would just be a big headache. So here I am going in with my iron. I'm trying to smooth the whole thing out, and you can see that there's a little bit too much fullness, but it wasn't enough to warrant me taking it apart and redoing that stitching. So I'm just very quickly closing the neckband here. I'm using a felling stitch. You can see at this point I've got one end of the neckband pinned in place just to keep it secure. Now the neckband is a different linen than the gauze that I use to actually make the Valona itself. And that's just because it's going to take so much more abrasion being up against a neck, particularly a guy's neck where there could be beard stubble underneath. So the fabric's going to take a beating, and it needs to be a little sturdier, so I used a heavier linen for that. But the closing of the neckband really is very basic. You just fold it over and hem it down, and then once that's done, we'll give it another final press, and then we'll put it in place with the Golilla and see how it fits. This is where it gets really fun, because the Valona collar itself is the white portion, and the Golilla, which is usually the name people hear for this type of collar, is actually just the support structure that goes underneath. When we put them together, though, they nest perfectly, and even though this linen is incredibly translucent, you can't really see the Golilla beneath it, and so it just looks like it's stiff and floating all on its own. As we look at this and we compare my current first attempt at this to the original, we can see that there are some issues. The proportions are a little bit off. My collar is a little bit too big. The points are not in the right place. There aren't enough tucks around the back. So I am in the process of making a brand new version of this. This one isn't terrible. It's a fantastic first attempt from my perspective. I have made much worse first attempts of things in the past, but I really learned a lot during this process, and I hope that you have too. It feels a little weird to wear. The contemporary accounts in the time period definitely say that this is an uncomfortable garment, but because it was a matter of Spanish pride, and it was also sort of there was a legal reason to wear it. They had outlawed the figure of 8 ruff, and this came in to replace it, and they made it a uniquely Spanish style based on the Dutch Valona falling collar. So that, coupled with the idea that you're supposed to be slightly uncomfortable, gives you a little bit of stoicism and austerity, I think that it was really a great garment for what Spain was trying to represent at the time. Now, the story goes that after it persisted for almost 100 years in various forms, it also became something of a joke culturally. It has a very interesting place in Spanish fashion, and I think that it's a really interesting garment. It's incredibly fun to make. The detail work of the very small stitches and the very fine work in this linen to be incredibly rewarding, even though it took longer to make than I actually expected. And I hope that you'll have a go at it and enjoy your own experimental process with the Golilla and the Valona collar. Thanks so much. Happy stitching.